AJ, I think budgets for small entrepreneur business owners may be the most useless financial tool on the planet.
What? I thought we were going to today talk about how to budget.
We absolutely are going to talk about budgets, but not in the way everybody thinks about them. Welcome to the Live Truly Free podcast.
George, if you're a startup entrepreneur, how are you going to know what you're spending your money on? How are you going to plan your money situation if you don't have a budget? It just sounds to me a little ridiculous to say it's useless.
So I've helped lead 19 companies, and over that time, I've seen a lot of different dynamics. And you're right, you've got to plan your money, but that's not what people think with a budget. They think their expenses. So in other words, they're like, oh, we're going to spend this much on rent, we're going to spend this much on marketing or office supplies or whatever, and they put all that together, but they don't budget revenue.
Oh, so you're not saying budgets in general are useless, but you're saying that the way that they're typically done is useless.
Right.
So how do you budget revenue then?
You don't. You project revenue. And so this is the difference between the traditional budgets are static, okay? And what I have used are, in literally every company I've ever helped lead, dynamic budgets, so that because when you're a small business owner, you don't know. If you're an entrepreneur, right? Revenue goes up one month, it goes down one month. It's all over the place. It's like riding a roller coaster.
Oh, I see. It is, and I completely agree with that now because as you project out your revenue, you have no idea, and obviously you're going to be biased towards, oh, it's going to keep going up every month, or especially if you're at like the very beginning and you're just starting sales, you're going to project revenue going up every month, but that might not necessarily be the case. And after that, if you're saying if you're planning on your revenue going up every month, then the traditional budget sense is going to be, well, let's plan on our expenses going up every month as well. But you're saying, well, what if the revenue doesn't go up every month? Because it is just a projection. It's not you don't actually know that revenue number.
You don't know the revenue number, but you can know the rent number. You can know your salary number. You can know your office expense number. Well, how do you do that? Well, what you have to do is you've got to put together a sophisticated sales funnel. And you've got to know leads and conversions and all that sort of thing. You need to know pricing and profit margins on your revenue. This is an area most people don't even look at. And because it's like you can know pretty good with a little history, like typically we generate this amount, and in other words, if we have this many leads coming in, which is a leading indicator, then we know that we can typically convert this percent and to this dollar amount in sales, whether it's products or services, it doesn't matter.
But that sounds like something only a large corporation would be able to like more accurately do. Like it sounds like that's a lot of intensive work and research and tracking and updating and all of that in order to be accurate with that.
Well, so let's go to the large corporation. I've been there. Okay. First of all, when you've got multiple departments, budgets make sense because you have an engineering department. Well, they have no revenue tied to the engineering. And so they're just an expense item.
Exactly. And same like with HR. Correct. They don't generate any revenue for the company, but they're necessary. So you need to budget for them.
And that's how you manage the larger corporations, or even if your company gets to where you've got multiple departments and things like that. So that makes sense. But in most cases, it doesn't. And honestly, I think revenue projection's easier with smaller companies. I'm making it sound like you got to do all this complicated stuff, but a lot of times you can just eyeball it. I've interacted with enough owner entrepreneurs, and usually those are the guys on the front, what I call the front end of the boat, where the sales are happening. Okay, they're typically, if they're not the rainmaker, they are very much aware of the rainmaking because they know if there's no rain, there's no rest of the boat, doesn't matter. We don't have any fuel for the engine to keep this thing going. So that's where. Of course, starting out, I'm not talking about that. You don't know. You've got to get out there and start finding your market. But if you've been in the marketplace for a while, a year or two, or even 3, you should have a pretty good feel for what it takes to generate sales, And if you just track some basic metrics, in other words, if you know like where your leads are coming in at, and then your conversion rates are very, very important. And there's several layers of that, where it's like a lead converts to a real conversation, let's say,
Hmm.
and then you close that. What's your closing rate on that when you like make a pitch? You know,
Yeah,
um, and and so you can start to establish that. And there's some great apps out there to help you with that. CRMs, customer relationship management kind of softwares to track all of that. Well, that's all before you get to the budget. Okay.
yeah,
But if you've got that kind of data, and if you've got, say, a couple of salespeople in-house or contract, I was about to say outhouse.
hmm,
uh, but that's you can know. So on certain individuals, you need to have specific data. Like Joe closes at about a 30% rate, Frank closes at a 40% rate, that sort of thing. Like if we give that lead to them, what's going to happen? Does that make
got
sense?
it. Yeah. So you're saying more that you should spend more of your effort projecting what your revenue is going to be because that's the ultimate determinant of how much money you have rather than trying to budget out, okay, once we're making this level of revenue, we're probably going to have to be spending this amount of money. And basically you're saying the traditional thinking is think expenses first and then revenue second. And we're trying to flip that, spend most time projecting the revenue, and then once you have the revenue, then you can determine what your
Right.
expenses should be based on that.
Right. So, and we're going to focus on that in just a second. As you say that, I'm just thinking about this founder. He started a company this year. I was talking with him, and he said he's, like, and everything he's read and studied and heard, it's pretty amazing to start out making profit. And he is. He goes, I'm profitable, and I'm very proud of that. And he should be. That's awesome. I think you should project profits because where the loss is going to come from, the only place, unless you've got outside money, that's going to fund losses, or your borrowed money, or you're using your credit cards. You've got to come up with other money to have losses.
You just made me think of a question here. Um, for like that startup company that is like at the very like day one, the money just hit the bank account.
Right.
And it's only at the idea stage. Like they're still going to have to spend money to get a actual product to market.
Right.
In that case, that's when you should budget in the traditional sense again, right? Where you're going to limit money towards each category based on the money that you've already raised. So I guess like that's still probably more in line with your budgeting technique of revenue budgeting, but instead it's just like this is the money we have and budgeting for that.
That's a really good point. But no, not budgeting that way. Here's what I do. Here's what you need to do. If you're starting up, you need what I would call, what are your startup costs? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I would put all of that. I would just, in other words, I'm not going to spread that over months. Okay. I'm going to show you guys in just a minute a technique, and we'll make it available on our website so you can download it. It's a simple little tool, but it's going to get you going in a great way. Here's the thing with startup, I don't necessarily need a time frame on that. What I need to know is what's the number. In other words, I would say do this, and I have done this with companies where we list everything we need to spend to get to where that first sale can occur. Okay. And so there's maybe some legal stuff to get set up. There's some maybe hiring we need to do. There's some, marketing or logo or branding costs and things like that. So I put all that together and I total it up. And I definitely will run that like a budget in the sense of categories and dollar amounts and that sort of thing.
Okay. So once I know my total startup costs, then I know how much money I need to go raise or put into the business if I already have it. Um, but then we spend all that money, all the startup costs, and then we get to the point where okay, we're at the revenue, we're starting to generate revenue. How do you start budgeting dynamically once you start getting revenue? rather than this old static method? Like, how does it actually get started?
Right. So let me make one comment on the startup cost. So basically, you're right. You've got to come up with that money somehow because there's no income coming in. And I would set that aside and like you're going to loan the company money, you're going to borrow money or whatever, or get friends and family. I wouldn't include that in the budget. Okay. That's its own separate number. It's separate. So when we begin dynamic budgeting, we're going to be going off of revenue projections. Now, don't think about this like day one, okay, of the company because you don't have any history. So let's say you're months into this and you've got a pretty good sense of your revenue projections. AJ, I can show you a dynamic spreadsheet and that will give an example. And so, look, this isn't going to be painful, guys. I just want to do a couple of quick illustrations. And for those of you who want this resource, we're going to have it available at livetrulyfree.com/downloads. And you can just go to this episode number 40 and look at it and download it. And I'm going to do a little instructional video of like how to use a spreadsheet. It's all ready. Formulas are ready to go. You can just add more lines and categories and things like that. But we want to explain the concept to you. And so for those watching on YouTube, you can see the actual spreadsheet, but we're going to work really, really hard to just describe the concept for those listening and you can't see the actual spreadsheet. So we're going to keep this really super simple. You're going to have a line for revenue, and we should probably do another podcast at some point on projecting revenue, kind of like what we were just describing. There's two main categories of expenses, fixed and variable. Okay, so fixed expenses, which I've got on the spreadsheet, would be things like your rent, your utilities, apps that you buy that you pay a monthly fee for. So, because those are going to be pretty much the same. Utilities could vary a little bit, but those are going to be pretty much the same every month. And so there's nothing dynamic about that. In other words, if I'm going to change my rent payment, I got to go rent somewhere else. It's not like a month to month kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And these fixed expenses, like you said, they're fixed, that you can't really change them. How do you know what's an acceptable level of fixed expenses to start with?
That's a great question. In this magical scenario, the fixed expenses total $2,000. So every month, I'm going to be making fixed expenses of $2,000. And it shouldn't be a big percentage of your expected revenue. And you are probably going to know, AJ, like you've been doing the business a while, you're probably going to know we should do anywhere from 10 to 15,000 and we're trying to get to 20 grand a month, So you should have some pretty good ideas. Now, there could be a fall off a cliff month, that sort of thing. And that's where this is going to help. Your other category is variable expenses. And you want that category to be most of your expenses. So kind of to your question is like, you don't want fixed expenses to be 80% of your expenses. You want it to be like 20% of your expenses.
Got it. So it's more of like try to minimize your fixed expenses and be very like diligent in what you add to that line. Like if you're going to add a fixed expense, it better be very useful in driving your business forward because most of your expenses you want to be below that on the variable line.
Right. So if you lock in a office lease, you need some office space, you got to have it, and you lock it in, you're going to lock it in for 12 months, 24, 36 months, something like that. You better be dang sure you can cover that number. Easily cover that number. Okay. So in the variable expenses, so I've got like my salary. Okay. So entrepreneur salary, contractors, because they're, sorry guys, but if we don't have it, we can't pay you. So we got to cut you back. And then like marketing, there's a whole bunch. So I'm saying in this scenario, you had 12,000 in revenue, the actual month, 12,000 in revenue, 2,000 in fixed expenses, which left you 10 grand. And you had 9,000 in variable, and so you had a profit of $1,000. I'm not going to give you the percentages; they're all on the spreadsheet, or go on the YouTube channel and you can see them on the spreadsheet here. What we do is we simply say, okay, those variable expenses were 90% of the revenue after I've paid my fixed expenses. So what happens if the revenue drops 3 months out? And so I'm looking at next month 1, next month 2, and next month 3. Revenue can go down, it can go up. And what I want to do is I want to have a dynamic budget that projects profit. I don't want to project losses. And so I want to make sure now, obviously, if revenue drops below $2,000, I've got a problem because that's going to be below my fixed expenses.
So you're saying that total variable percentage, that's the percentage your variable cost is after your fixed cost.
Right.
All of them are 90%. Is that where you're trying to like cap it at? So then you stay at 10% profit?
Right. So what I'm saying is that I know I'm going to spend $2,000. Okay. That's just coming off the top. And then the revenue that comes after that, I'm going to spend 90% of that revenue. Instead of having a dollar amount for variable expenses, we're going to have a percent. And we're going to say 90%. And so you can see on the spreadsheet, I've taken it by category and I broke it apart. Well, like my salary is going to go down. The entrepreneur salary is going to go down if revenue goes down. But if revenue goes up and it's higher than $12,000, I'm going to make my salary is going to go up, and I'll have more for contractors. I'll have more for all of my variable expenses while I'm still making a profit on the bottom line.
And with that, you just touched on the salary piece. You have to be okay with making your salary a variable expense. I really like the idea of saying, okay, we're going to say after we have our revenue minus our fixed cost, the money after that, we're only going to spend 90% of. So that way, 10% of it we get to keep in net income, and that goes to our business. The percentage, I think, is a much better way to look at it. That creates a control for yourself that we're not going to go above this amount on the spending.
Yes. So in reality, AJ, that 10% of net income is actually a cushion because you could go to zero and still be okay. You go negative, it's going to come out of somebody's pocket, probably the owner's. What you want to do is in the dynamic budgeting world is you want to be building up a cash cushion, a cash reserve. So if you could just even save a few $100s every month and just slide it over so that you start to have a way to self-finance the downturns, the months that fall off. And so when a month goes up real high, don't go spend it all. That's where actually fixed budgeting could help.
What you're saying here is basically you want to manage you're going to have your fixed costs, but you want to manage your variable costs to the cash flow of the company, so that you're generating a positive cash flow and you can eventually accumulate some of that and save it.
Correct. And here's the thing, as you're saying all of that, what I need to say is there's a huge strategy here. And if you go back to last week's episode, how to make more money, rent or buy, what we're talking about there is it's better to buy. You're going to make more profits. But the problem with in the early years of the startup, you need variable expenses. So how do you have variable expenses? When we say rent, it could be lease, it could be paying the subscription service. If I'm paying month to month, let's use subscription because everybody can relate to that. So typically the way it works is they go, okay, it's $100 a month or $1,000 if you pay for the year in advance. But if I pay for the $1,000 a year in advance, I may either not need it, or I may, I get stuck in that I'm out $1,000 and I don't have $1,000, but I can do $100 a month. But if I do $100 a month and my revenue drops, I can cut that subscription off for a month and save $100. And so in the early years or months, it's really better to have a lot more variable expenses than locking in prices, because you got to understand what you need, what you don't need, and you've got to be able to cut month-to-month expenses like overnight sometimes.
Yeah. So be very diligent with the variable expenses you have, but be even more diligent with the fixed expenses you have, because those aren't going away. And what we're basing this entire dynamic budget off of is the money you have available after your fixed expenses. Correct. So you have to be very, very, like, when you decide to add a fixed expense line, it better be a very good reason for it.
That's right, AJ. And honestly, this is as much about managing money as it is beginning to think dynamically. I will tell you this: if you can begin to think as the entrepreneur owner, business owner, with my revenues go up and down, and I've got to be making adjustments because I've got to keep that bottom line at the same percent. I want to keep that 10% or 15 or whatever you want your bottom line to be, whatever's reasonable in your industry. Then you start thinking dynamically, you will be profitable and you will grow and you'll become bigger and bigger and bigger. For individuals, what I would say, and this works for corporations too, is you want to be building cash reserves. When you have cash reserves, it changes your whole frame of mind. So for more on this topic, go check out this video right here, which was last week's on rent or buy. And until next time, may you live truly free.